Hello and welcome to my presentation about the impact of cultural norms on reactions to national crises, where I compared the behavior by populations in reaction to the crises in Argentina and Lebanon. Very quick overview, I will give a brief introduction about why I actually decided to compare those two countries. I'll give a brief overview of the economic crises in Argentina and Lebanon, and then talk about the cultural impacts on how Argentina and Lebanon have been dealing with their recent political crises before I leave it with some concluding remarks. So why actually compare Argentina and Lebanon out of all countries? Well, primarily because looking at countries that were affected by hyperinflation over the past 5+ years, Argentina and Lebanon were the only countries that ranked in the electoral democracy index above zero point 0.4, which means that both have some democratic uh, functions and foundations, which doesn't apply to other countries that were affected by hyperinflation within the same time frame. Countries like Venezuela, for example, that would rank much, much lower in the electoral democracy index. So here we already have somewhat of a common ground that allows this kind of comparison. And it just makes sense to compare them because both countries were, at the end of the day, affected by very severe economic crises. The World Bank stated that the economic crisis in Lebanon was one of the three most severe economic crises over the past 150 years. So that just highlights the intensity of it and the importance to analyze it from different angles, not just the purely economical, but also from a more cultural dimension. So an overview of the crisis. In early 2024, Argentina's inflation rate was above 124%. Lebanon's inflation rate was around 229%. And by October 2023, Lebanon had experienced 38 successive months of hyperinflation. Argentina had its highest inflation in more than 3 decades. So by 2023, 40% of the Argentinian and 82% of the Lebanese population lived in poverty, which was a stark increase by 35% in Argentina and 42% in Lebanon in the 4 years leading up to 2023, and since the crisis really accelerated in both countries. Reasons for the crisis in Argentina were primarily state overspending and large-scale money borrowing, primarily from the IMF, and a dramatic increase in printing of the Argentine peso, which obviously drastically weakened the value of the currency. In Lebanon, the main reasons for the crisis were unrestrained borrowing by the sectarian elites, and since Lebanon does not possess any significant natural resources, there was far less capital flowed into the country than was borrowed and spent. Hence, more money was borrowed to repay international creditors. An increase in Iranian presence in Lebanon through Hezbollah caused a decline in support from Sunni Gulf states such as the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, which used to pump a lot of money into Lebanon in earlier years. Now, the central bank tried to balance out those deficits by encouraging the banks within the country to put more US dollars in the central bank, and the banks tried to encourage their depositors to do so based on a strong increase in interest rates, which reached 16% at some point, at a time where in the rest of the world interest rates were really low. Obviously, there was no sustainability to it because there was no economic flow uh, taking place within the Lebanese market. Hence, the money that went into the central bank would never be seen again, at least up to this point, by the debitors that put them in their bank accounts within the country. So the different cultural norms that I want to compare here, just a brief overview of the general cultural norms that we um, need to consider to understand how people in different societies interact based on unwritten rules with how people communicate, whether it's direct or indirect, how people provide negative feedback, what's the perception of hierarchy within society, how are decisions being made, how is trust being developed, whether that's based on how well you know a person at a personal level or rather the professional credentials a person has, how people disagree, whether it's confrontational or less confrontational, and what's the perception of time, whether it's a linear time perception like Germans or Swiss people tend to have, or more of a flexible understanding of time and scheduling, like many people in the Middle East and South America tend to prioritize. For the purpose of this comparison here, we will focus on how trust is being built, leadership and decision making, and how negative feedback is being provided in the political context. So let's start by talking about trust. In Lebanon's 2022 election, trust in traditional Christian political leaders declined, as seen in the loss of seats by the Free Patriotic Movement and the rise of new progressive parties, especially among younger, educated voters, which indicates a move towards task-based trust, focusing on political skills rather than emotional ties to leaders. But here we need to highlight that it is really primarily younger and more educated voters and not the larger Lebanese population as such. So there's still a very strong relationship build trust amongst large groups of the population. In Argentina, during the 2023 elections, there was a significant shift with Javier Milei, a candidate outside the political establishment, receiving strong support, particularly from young and working class voters, which indicates a decline in relationship-based trust in traditional leaders and a move towards task-based trust influenced by economic frustration. Here it's very important to highlight that when we talk about task-based trust and relationship-based trust, it's all about perception of the voters. It's not the factual reality, whether Javier Milei, for example, has the skills that it takes to maneuver Argentina out of its crisis in a more advanced state than other political leaders in Argentina might have. But it's about what the population thinks and feels, and hence makes their decisions based on this when it comes to voting. So to conclude, both countries saw a move away from relationship-based trust during the crises, but Argentina showed a clearer shift towards task-based trust, while Lebanon's social-political factors preserved stronger cultural norms around trust. Next point, leading and decision-making. Lebanon is slightly more hierarchical than Argentina, as we saw in the comparative scales a few slides ago, contributing to a larger division between political elites and the general public in Lebanon. In both Lebanon and Argentina, political elites have maintained power for decades, despite corruption scandals due to a lack of public scrutiny in times of stability. Hence, again, more relationship-based trust rather than a more factual understanding of trust. This lack of scrutiny is linked to relationship-based trust in hierarchical societies, where leaders hold privileges as long as the country functions reasonably well. However, during crises such as in Lebanon and Argentina, political leaders advocating for more egalitarian, consensual leadership saw the biggest increases in votes, indicating a shift towards interest in more inclusive forms of decision-making. So despite Lebanon's stronger hierarchical culture and history of corruption, Argentina is more likely to experience a greater shift towards egalitarian leadership in response to the crises. Of course, as mentioned before, while younger Lebanese are also calling for more egalitarian leadership, cultural shifts across all ages and sectarian groups in Lebanon will likely take much, much longer. Even though both crises are reshaping political behavior, the impact is more pronounced in Argentina than in Lebanon. And then finally, the way that feedback is being provided in countries. And here I focused comparatively on the way that political protests took place in both countries. You can see that in general, Lebanese tend to provide less direct negative feedback than Argentinians, who can be a bit more frank, hence position farther on the left on the scale here when it comes to evaluation. And we also saw that in protest behavior. So in Lebanon, the 2019 October movement saw over 1 million people protest, but since then, protests have been less frequent, with dissatisfaction expressed more through small-scale unrest rather than large-scale protest. In Argentina, there has been more frequent medium-sized protests, often focused on political and economic issues. So despite the larger protests in Lebanon in 2019, Argentina's more consistent culture of protest suggests a stronger inclination to provide direct political feedback. So while both countries faced economic crises, the cultural norm of indirect feedback in Lebanon makes it harder to sustain large-scale protests despite temporary shifts in response to the crisis. And in Argentina, protests were smaller but more frequent, indicating a more ingrained practice of expressing negative feedback. Cultural factors alongside social political influences shape how people in each country express their dissatisfaction during times of crisis. So to conclude then, cultural norms in each country guide societal behavior, but crises can also shift these norms, potentially leading to cultural paradigm shifts. In Lebanon, we saw that these shifts are slower and more complex due to its social political fragmentation. Here I refer to, which will be elaborated in more detail in the book chapter, on the sectarian divisions in the country, and changes are more noticeable in smaller subcultural groups, especially among younger generations, potentially leading to generational divides rather than large-scale societal shifts in the way that cultural norms are being applied to in the political arena. In Argentina, a more substantial cultural shift towards egalitarian leadership and consensual decision-making seems more likely, though its sustainability remains uncertain. For that, we obviously need to see how the political developments will occur over the years to come and how the population will react to them. And shifts could be more widespread, impacting broader cultural scales. But for that, we also, again, have to keep a close eye on how the general population acts and reacts in between elections, and also see if we notice new drastic changes or maybe a maintenance of the changes that occurred in 2023 in the next elections. So overall, the cultural gap between Argentina and Lebanon could grow larger as both countries navigate the economic crises, with Argentina potentially experiencing a more significant transformation in its political culture over the mid and long term. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to further discussing these points with you in the comments below.